Hello, everyone. This is Alan Gilman for another edition of TorahBytes Live. One of the most difficult questions that anyone ever asks is the question, why? Some of us don't give ourselves the freedom to ask. It's very common among people of faith to think that ours is not to reason why, that we think that what's actually a more stoic approach of the stiff upper lip is the right way to be. And so whether you're a person of faith, of biblical faith, of no faith, you may have been brought up to not question. And I don't mean asking questions in class, though my experience in classroom situations is there's only usually a very few people that feel comfortable asking questions to the teacher or to the professor. I used to be one of them, but very often most people, whatever the reason is, they don't like asking questions. I remember the first time my eldest daughter asked, "Why, Daddy?" I could still see myself where I was. I think it was into the bathroom, and she looked up at me, and I don't know what she was responding to, and she looked up at me with her innocent, beautiful eyes and said, "Why, Daddy?" And this being my first child, I thought, "Whoa, what an incredible interaction! She's becoming mature." And I inquired what the question was about, and she looked up at me, and she said, "Why, Daddy? What are you asking me? Why, Daddy?" Well, it turns out she didn't really know what why meant, and somehow she must have picked it up and just saw it as something to say. And so the interesting thing is, I think a lot of us don't even understand what the question why really means. And that's one of the things we want to unpack in the next few minutes. We want to look at what does why mean, and is it something we should be asking in life? Is it something we should be asking God or not? So this week we're looking at the reading from the books of Moses. It's called Ekev. It's from Devarim, the fifth book of the Torah, the fifth book of Moses, Deuteronomy, chapter 7, verse 12, through chapter 18 and verse 25. And this week's TorahBytes message, we looked at a passage, Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 9, verses 4 through 5, and God was dealing with a why question. And he was saying to the people, he was anticipating what they were thinking as to why they were able to conquer the people of the land. And remember, almost 40 years earlier, when 12 scouts went in to check out the land of Israel, 10 of them believed that there was no way that they could actually do it because the people and the cities were so powerful. Only two, Caleb and Joshua, believed they could. And they believed they could not because that the report of strength was incorrect. They believed they could do it because God would enable them to do it. But why? Why would God enable the people to do it, which they would do eventually almost 40 years later under the leadership of Joshua? And so God was anticipating that they would conclude an answer to the question why. Why was God enabling us to do this, to conquer the land? And he was telling them, don't think it's because you're morally or spiritually superior that you're able to do this. There were two reasons why God enabled the people of Israel to conquer the then existing peoples of the land of what was then called Canaan, now called the land of Israel. There are two reasons why. One, because of the people's wickedness. It had nothing to do with the people of Israel in one sense. The people's wickedness had become so severe that the only thing that God left for God to do was to eradicate the people. And he was using Israel as an instrument of judgment. It had nothing to do with their being morally superior. The other reason was that God had made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he was going to keep that promise to give them the land. One of the amazing things about God is how he's able to do multiple things at the same time. It's not just multitasking, that he works in this very complex way and dealing with complex things all at the same time. And so he managed to allow to coincide both the judgment of the peoples with the fulfillment of the promise centuries earlier to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's what he was doing through Israel conquering the land. And so it was not about anything about their internal goodness, this moral superiority. It was for other reasons. And it was important for them to know that. It was important for them to know why God was enabling them to acquire the land. And so in this case, God was anticipating the why question. If ever they would think, why did we inherit this land? Why did we acquire the land? Here are the reasons why. And so it was important for God to tell them, and of course, for generations after them to know the reason why they were able to acquire the land. And so from this alone, I conclude it's okay to ask why. In fact, it's more than just okay to ask why. I believe from a biblical perspective, it's necessary for us to ask why. So where do we get this idea that we shouldn't? And so there's that quote that is so familiar that goes, where is it here? I wrote it down. There's not a reason why, there's not a reason why. And where it's from, it's not from the Bible. It's actually the second stanza of the famous poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. I'll read you the whole verse, the whole stanza. It goes like this. Forward, the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. There's not to make reply. There's not to reason why. There's but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. And whether the principles expressed in this poem are right or wrong, in this particular context, this is talking about soldiers who have been commanded to go into battle. They might live, they might die, but theirs is not to reason why. It's not for them to analyze the situation and understand what this is all about. Theirs is, in this case, is only to obey. So this is something being expressed in this particular context of a battle, soldiers in battle. This is not a general life principle. And yet for some reason, people think that the Bible teaches this sort of thing, that ours is not to reason why. I remember years ago talking to a man in Toronto. As you probably know, my wife and I and our family were Jewish. We're Jewish believers in Yeshua, the Messiah. And I was talking to another Jewish man who had some belief in God and some belief in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. I'm not too sure. Just met him. We're talking about faith. We're talking about God. We're talking about Yeshua, Jesus, with this man. And in the course of discussion, there was some question. And all I remember from the interchange was that he said, when he was a young person, if he would have asked such a question to his rabbi, the rabbi would say to him, and this is not a statement on all rabbis, it isn't, but there are many people that have had similar experiences with religious teachers. Some of it is explicit, or some of it's just an impression that they got. And in this case, his religious teacher told him, and it was, if you ever ask a question like that again, I'll kill you. He didn't mean he was actually going to kill him. It was a way of expressing to the young person that there are certain questions you don't ask. I remember I spent some time with a rabbi many years ago when we're living in Vancouver. This is a long time ago. This is in the late 80s. And I would meet about once a week with this particular rabbi. And both our agendas was try to convince each other of our perspectives. There's something about this particular rabbi that I really liked, and we were able to engage, and we were able to have meaningful conversations. And I remember talking to my father-in-law many years ago and relaying to him the approach that this particular rabbi had. I remember him saying to me, and my father-in-law died many years ago now. I remember him saying to me that perhaps if he would have had a rabbi like that, then maybe he would be religious still to that day, because he had been religious as a young person, and certain things happened that turned him off from religion, turned him off from God completely, and he became a committed atheist. But interestingly, he's at least saying that it was actually his impression, to be fair, his impression and his experience, mainly back in Europe, was that there was a particular arrogance expressed by religious leaders that, again, in his experience, that turned him off from the Jewish religion and all religion, just because of that. And while your experience may not be exactly like that, I wonder how common that really is. In other words, I think it's quite common that we get an impression that we're not supposed to ask particular questions. We're not supposed to ask why. And then we take that experience from religious contexts and then we transfer them to God himself, thinking there's certain questions we can't even ask God. And the big question, the biggest of all questions that we're not allowed to ask is why. That why God is an illegitimate question. And I think that's bunk. I think that's ridiculous. That if you actually have read the Bible, then you would know that of all the questions to be asked, God, why is one of the most important ones. I might have mentioned this in a recent TorahBytes live broadcast. I can't remember, so forgive me. But anyway, this might be the first time you heard it. Somebody posted on Facebook a Christian scholar statement, and it was something like, when God says something, that ends the argument. And maybe I should say this. I should bring this up every time I do TorahBytes live. And I looked at this, and it sounded so noble. It sounded so whatever. You call it whatever you want. When God says something, that ends the argument. But this person was supposed to be a Bible scholar. And I thought to myself, what book was he reading? Because if you read the Bible, it seems once God says something, that begins the argument. God, when he speaks in his word, is actually calling us to engage with him, not shutting us down. If anything, like one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Jacob wrestling with God, or actually God wrestling with Jacob, because God initiated that interchange. And the whole story of Jacob and the transformation of Jacob's life, and then the subsequent history of the people of Israel, and even we see this in the Messiah himself, is holding on to God and wrestling with God and striving with God and prevailing like Jacob did. In order to do that, we have to be able to ask God very, very hard questions, and why being one of them. So what does the word why actually mean? I wonder how many of us have actually stopped, just like my little daughter years ago, looking up at me and saying, "Why, Daddy?" without really knowing what it meant. I wonder if we know what we mean when we ask the question why. Well, I did a little bit of research, and the origin of the English word why comes from the German. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. And you can look it up in Oxford's dictionary online. And what it means is by what cause. So by what cause is this particular thing? So, why did you do that? It's by what cause. It's like, what's the basis of your doing that? What's the basis of this circumstance occurring? And that makes a lot of sense. If you know French, or if you don't know French, the French word for why is pourquoi. It's one word, pourquoi, but it's actually made up of two words, pourquoi, for what. And it's the same sort of idea. It's Spanish, the same, por qué, for or by what. And I was surprised when I thought about it. It should be obvious. The Hebrew is similar. When we talk about semantics, the origins of words, the semantics that are at work in Hebrew is usually not the same as European type languages. In this case, however, it is, because the Hebrew word for why is lama. Lama. It has nothing to do with the sheep-like animal that spits. It's not llama, or however you want to pronounce it. So lama sounds really funny. Lama, funny to English speakers, lama is for or by what? I was looking it up in an online lexicon. A lexicon is not a little Irish green man. A lexicon is a special type of dictionary. And so when you look up Hebrew or Greek biblical words. It's a lexicon that you use. And I recommend the Blue Letter Bible, as a really good resource for this. And so when you look up the word lama, you look up why in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the word's lama. And if you click on it, the word is what? And then you have the l at the beginning is a prefix, and Hebrew works like that with root words and various kinds of prefixes at the beginning of the word and suffixes at the end of the word. So the word is actually what? With the prefix l, for or by what? So for what reason? And why? Why did you do that? For what reason did you do it is what is being asked. Unless you're like my little daughter who wasn't actually thinking about it. And sometimes it's like that, because sometimes when we go, why did you do that? We're not asking for what reason. We're not inviting the person to give an explanation. We're actually saying, I don't like what you did, or I'm blaming you for what you did. And for a lot of people, when they ask, why did God, for example, many of my people, why did God allow the Holocaust? Are we actually looking for an answer? Do we really want to know the reasons behind the Holocaust? For many people, why did God allow the Holocaust is really code for there is no God because there was a Holocaust. And on a more individual level, perhaps you had a parent who died when you were young. The question, why did God allow my mother to die? Why did God not answer my prayers? Is not a request for the reasons. It's simply saying, I cannot believe in God because this happened. So it's not a question at all. It's simply a way to express a sense of I can't think of the word, of being of just anger and being flustered. I don't mean to make it, I'm not belittling this at all. We express certain things simply because we're upset and angry. And what we've done is we have chosen, consciously or subconsciously, to answer the question why. I think I know why. Why did the Holocaust happen? It's because there is no God. Or if there is a God, he's a bad God. Why did God allow this bad thing to happen to me? And then I derive my own conclusions. And so what we're doing is, and so, many of us won't even ask the question. We just answer it on our own. We think we know why, and so we don't do anything about it. And so what happens is we're robbing ourselves of a proper understanding of what caused whatever it is. And the second, the reasonable response to the actual reasons why. And so anyway, to kind of illustrate this, I had an experience I think it was yesterday. So back in May, I spent 2 weeks in Victoria and other parts of Vancouver Island on a teaching tour. And when I came back, I discovered that my wife had arranged. We have this kind of this holder for a garden hose, so that you can store the garden hose on this, whatever you call it, on this wheel, and it has a stand. And the way it works is you attach the water to the contraption, and then the hose goes to the contraption. And so the water goes through the contraption to the hose, and then it's easy to store the hose because you can crank the wheel, and it allows the hose to be stored well. And she told me that she was having trouble setting it up, and she got the next door neighbor, and he's a construction type person, and he had a really hard time setting it up. Okay, so it was difficult. And if it was difficult for him, it would have been way more difficult for me, because I'm not a construction type person. I'm not really very mechanical myself. I do things, I can fix certain things, but it's really not my area. It's not a place where I feel very comfortable. And so I immediately thought, based on the story I heard, that if it was difficult for him. For me to do anything with it would be even more difficult, maybe impossible. But what was happening was every time the water was turned on, there was water was getting sprayed all over the place and soaking this area in front of our house. And yet it seemed to me I had to live with this, with the water. I don't know how much water was actually making it onto our lawn, and the front of our house was getting soaked as things were sprayed. My wife was tolerating it. I was looking every time I'd see this thing on, I'd look at this thing and go, oh, I should do something about it. And then thought, well, it's going to be pretty near impossible for me to do anything about it. Maybe we got to get a whole new contraption and go through all that, but I have other things to do. And because this thing, anyway, it seemed like this big mountainous task for me to take care of. So it was a lot easier to ignore it. I'm not proud of this story, but it gets more interesting. And so yesterday I had enough. And I warned my wife that when I took the thing apart, because what I thought really was going on was where the hose was attached to the contraption, that you're supposed to have a little rubber or plastic washer inside. And if you don't, it sprays in the way that I saw it spraying. I assumed there's no washer. It's a little strange to me, though, because if the neighbor set it up, I thought there's no way that he would have put it in without the washer. So it was a little mysterious, but it was obviously that must have been, to me, that's what the problem was. And so I warned her that if I managed to get this very difficult thing off, then she would be without it for a little while, and I'd have to go off, or she would go off to get the little inexpensive washer. And so I found our locking pliers, and I got ready, and I was really trying to figure out how I was going to get the hose off the contraption. And I looked at it, and I'm looking there, and I touched the area where the hose was connected to the contraption, and it was really loose. In fact, it was hardly on at all. And so without the pliers, I simply took the hose off the contraption and looked inside, and there was the washer. And actually what was going on, for some reason that I don't know, the hose wasn't even put on the contraption properly. And so I then attached it. It took me a few seconds, turned it with my hand, tightened it, turned the thing back on, and there is a little bit of drip. I think the contraption's a little bit broken inside, but a little tiny drip instead of this big spray. And there it was. And that's all to say, I hadn't taken the time to ask the situation why. I assumed I knew. And so I assumed I knew, and I was all frustrated. I thought, like, what in the world went on? And how, like, is my neighbor incompetent? And why was my wife putting up with this? And then I was upset at myself because I didn't really want to deal with it. And it was all based on me, well, actually quick thinking I knew the reason why without investigating. So my hesitancy to truly ask why and get the real answer caused all this unnecessary grief in me, and all this time of it not functioning properly, all because I didn't take the time to ask why. How much of our life's problems are due to the fact that we're not asking why? Of course, when you ask why, we need to wait for an answer or work towards an answer, do the analysis. And do you know why this is so important? And it's why it's important from a biblical point of view? Because our role on this planet is to be its stewards. God created human beings to take care of the planet. We were supposed to take the fundamentals of planet Earth, and we were to cultivate them. We were to take the chaos of life and put it into order. That's what we're here for. Now, there's more to life and why we've had trouble with life than just that. Because we disobeyed God, and that really put life out of whack. And much of the Bible is about how God wants to put it into whack, is to restore things the way they should be. And that's what Yeshua the Messiah came to do, and that's so important. But that doesn't take away the very basic aspect that we were put on earth to take care of it. And in order to take care of it, we need to ask the question, why? That's what we're doing most of the time. You go to see the doctor and there's something wrong with you. He needs to find out what it is. And he has to then find out what's causing it. And then what is the best treatment? There's so many whys being asked in order to come to. I had a doctor years ago. He was specialized in treating some particular things, and he actually didn't ask why. He had developed an understanding of a set of disorders, and he actually came prepared with his diagnosis. He actually thought there was this whole set of symptoms that were caused by a certain lack, and his treatment was the solution. Now, what made him effective at all is he was right some of the time. Sadly, he thought his understanding and his approach applied to far more people than actually did. So he didn't actually take the time to ask the important whys. He simply applied his approach to everybody. And so for the people that it worked for, it worked. And because it was a kind of condition that was causing fatigue and headaches and some of these common things that are often difficult to diagnose, because he was helping some people, he was able to sell his treatment to a larger group of people, because people were all frustrated with not being helped. And because he helped some people, maybe he would help them too. Sadly, when it didn't work for them, and I was one of those people, he actually told me it's because I wasn't doing his treatment enough or good enough. So he was kind of squishing me into his way of seeing things. He was not willing to really ask the important questions. How much of our lives are not the way they should be because we're not willing to ask the questions? And how much of our life with God isn't what it should be because we're not asking him why? When Yeshua taught his disciples to pray, one of the key lines, they're all key. We're supposed to pray, your kingdom come and your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And that means the way things are on earth is not the way God wants them to be. And one of the ways they're going to be transformed into how God wants them to be is we're supposed to pray that prayer. God, look at this situation. It's wrong. It's bad. People are dying. People are hurt. Relationships are being ripped apart. God, please come and may your will be done in this situation as it is in heaven. And if we're called to pray that, we're also called to be part of the process. That we need to look to God and say, God, is there anything that I could do to bring about your will that's not yet being done? And so all that's for what reason is this happening? What is the basis of this thing happening? What's the reason? Why God? Why God? Why God? Now, he might say enough, but we give up too easy. God wants us to reason why. Seek him as to what is going on. Are you having trouble in your close relationships? Are you having difficulty in your work? Are you having difficulty work with people? Are you having difficulty are you having trouble finding what you should be doing? Ask why. What's the problem? What's the problem? What's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with them? What's wrong with the situation? God wants to answer those prayers, and he wants us to work at finding the right answers to the right problems. All right. I want to come back very briefly, just before we close, to that other kind of why question. And it's why are you allowing this to happen to me, God? Why? And which I mentioned earlier, that's not really an investigation into the reasons. And I would encourage you, when there's disaster, when there's things that are really horrible and terrible, and they are so troubling you, ask God why. he just might give you the reasons, and then you have something to work with. And then if you're upset, you'll like, and you have good reason to be upset. Once you actually know what's going on, at least you have something to interact with. And then I encourage you to go further in asking God why and asking God for what reason and all the rest. But it's very difficult to find any resolve to any difficult question in life when we're not in right relationship with the person who's ultimately responsible. And that's why uh, the question, why God, can't be answered by someone who is out of sorts with God. So the only way to get real answers from God is, first and foremost, we need to be in right relationship with him. And that's a big why that Yeshua the Messiah has answered. He has resolved. Because of the disobedience and what's the Bible calls sin that we've inherited from our ancestors, going all the way back to Adam and Eve, and that has separated us from God. And so we're not really on speaking terms with him. We're not really God's friends. But Yeshua came to give himself that we could be restored to right relationship with God. And if we answer this major, the big why question, what's wrong with me? Now there's things wrong in the world, but what's wrong with me? Why am I like this? Why is my life like this? Well, the big why is we're separated from God. And through what Yeshua has done, we can be restored to him. We could become God's friends. We could be on speaking terms with him. And then we're in a place where we could ask him the really hard why questions. And you will be amazed at how much God wants to show you. He may not download all that information at once, but there are things like, so we're living life in a state, it's similar to what I was going through with the water hose. I was relating to that whole situation according to nonsense, actually. And I had emotion and I was trying to plan life based on nonsense. I guess I was pretty stupid, actually. But once I was willing to approach that situation, I saw that it really wasn't that difficult to resolve after all. And while there are major issues in our lives, you would be surprised that once you're on speaking terms with God, through having a relationship with him through Yeshua the Messiah, trusting in him, in his death and his resurrection, when that gets resolved, so much of life actually becomes way easier. All of a sudden the lights go on. So many questions get answered. So many things that we thought were big deals are not big deals anymore because of the incredible changes that he makes in our hearts. And then we're in a place where we can face the most difficult questions, the most difficult whys of our lives. So if you have never asked Yeshua into your heart and life, turn to God in his name, I encourage you to do so right now. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to email me at alan@alangilman.ca. You can also leave comments in the comment section, and please share this video with others. And if you find this video helpful, maybe you would consider making a donation so that I can keep doing videos and like this and other forms of teaching that I do. So until next time, this is Alan Gilman for TorahBytes Live.